You're nothing but a lowly delivery boy. How dare you even speak in my courtroom? Judge Margaret Whitmore spat, her voice sharp like a blade. The room fell into stunned silence. The bailiff, the lawyers, the spectators, everyone froze. The black man standing before her, dressed in a brown delivery uniform, tightened his jaw but remained calm. His eyes, however, burned with a quiet intensity. You people, the judge continued, sneering as she leaned forward from her high bench, should be grateful we even let you work here. Now, get out of my sight before I have you arrested for trespassing. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The insult was loud, clear, cruel. The delivery man clenched his fists at his sides, but he didn't move. 7 minutes later, Judge Whitmore was in handcuffs. Her mouth hung open in shock, her expensive pearl necklace trembling with the shake of her body. The very black man she had humiliated was the one standing before her now, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. You're under arrest, Judge Whitmore, he said. His voice was steady, strong. She blinked, her body stiffening. This is a joke, she stammered. But the cold steel cuffs around her wrists said otherwise. 12 hours earlier, the delivery truck rolled up to the Grand Courthouse steps in downtown Atlanta. It was an early morning, the sky still a hazy shade of orange and pink. James Carter, a 32-year-old black man with sharp brown eyes and a muscular frame, stepped out of the truck, carrying a medium-sized package. His uniform, though neat, had faint traces of dust from the early morning deliveries. James had been working at the delivery company for nearly a decade, making his way up the ranks. He was efficient, respectful, and professional. But today, fate had something else planned for him. As he walked up the courthouse steps, a security guard barely glanced at him before waving him inside. The large halls of the courthouse echoed with footsteps and murmured conversations. He made his way to the front desk, where a young receptionist with curly blonde hair smiled at him. Delivery for Judge Whitmore, James said, setting the package gently on the counter. The receptionist nodded, flipping through some papers. She's in courtroom B, hearing a case right now. If it's urgent, you can drop it off inside. James hesitated. Usually, he left packages at the front desk, but sometimes, urgent ones needed to be handed directly to the recipient. He checked the label. This one was marked urgent. Nodding to himself, he thanked the receptionist and made his way down the hall toward courtroom B. As he approached, he could hear the judge's voice, stern, cold, and commanding. Inside, the courtroom was filled with people. A trial was underway, and all eyes were on Judge Whitmore, a woman in her mid-50s with short blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. She had a reputation for being ruthless, especially toward minorities. James took a deep breath and stepped inside. He waited patiently near the back, holding the package close to his chest. The case continued, and he tried not to draw attention to himself. But then, a pause in the proceedings gave him his opening. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward slightly and spoke in a firm yet polite voice. Excuse me, Your Honor. I have a delivery for you. Silence. Judge Whitmore turned her gaze toward him, her face twisting in annoyance. Her eyes scanned his uniform, her nose wrinkling slightly as though she smelled something unpleasant. Who let you in here? She asked sharply. James, taken aback by her tone, remained professional. The front desk told me to bring this directly to you. It's marked as urgent. Judge Whitmore's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, urgent, is it? She glanced around the room. Look at this. A delivery boy interrupting my courtroom. A few chuckles echoed from the wealthier-looking individuals sitting in the back rows. James exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Her expression darkened. Ma'am? Do I look like your ma'am? I am a judge, and you will address me as Your Honor. But I don't expect someone like you to understand respect. James' grip tightened around the package, his nails pressing into the cardboard. I apologize, Your Honor, he said, forcing himself to stay calm. Would you like me to leave the package with the clerk? Judge Whitmore leaned forward. I'd like you to leave, period. Her voice dropped into a venomous whisper. I don't care what errand boy uniform you wear. You don't belong in my courtroom. Get out. The weight of her words settled over the room like a thick, suffocating fog. James felt every set of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he had dealt with people like her before. Without another word, he nodded, set the package on the table near the clerk, and turned to leave. The moment he stepped outside the courtroom, he exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the sting of humiliation. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over. And he was right. 7 minutes later, he was back inside that same courtroom. Only this time, he wasn't holding a package. He was holding a pair of handcuffs. And Judge Margaret Whitmore was about to learn that James Carter was far more than just a delivery man. He was an undercover federal agent. The courtroom was frozen in shock. Judge Margaret Whitmore's face twisted in disbelief as James Carter stood before her, not as a delivery man, but as a federal agent. This is ridiculous, she spat, yanking against the cold steel cuffs. Do you have any idea who I am? James remained calm, his face unreadable. I do, he said, his voice steady. And that's why you're under arrest. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The attorneys, the clerks, even the bailiff, who had stood by the judge's side for years, looked on with wide eyes. Judge Whitmore's breath came in sharp gasps. Her pearl necklace shifted against her throat as she turned to the bailiff. Get these off me. Now. But the bailiff didn't move. Instead, he looked at James. Agent Carter? James nodded. This is a federal matter. She's coming with me. The judge's eyes darted around wildly. This is insane. On what charges? James took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle before he spoke. Corruption, tampering with evidence, bribery, and, most importantly, he leaned in slightly, a hate crime. The room exploded into gasps. Judge Whitmore's face drained of color. Hate crime? That's absurd. James didn't waver. It's all on record, Your Honor. Witnesses, audio, and a long history of racial bias in your courtroom. For the first time, the once powerful judge looked small. Fragile. Take her into custody, James ordered. The bailiff hesitated, looking between James and the judge, then reluctantly stepped forward. But before he could take her, Judge Whitmore did something no one expected. She lunged. With a sudden burst of rage, she twisted, slamming her shoulder into James with surprising force. The unexpected attack sent him stumbling back a step. The room erupted into chaos, people gasping, attorneys backing away. The judge's breathing was ragged as she turned toward the doors, trying to flee. But James was faster. In a single motion, he grabbed her by the arm and twisted, sending her crashing onto the courtroom floor. She let out a sharp cry as he pinned her down, his knee pressing lightly against her back. You're making this worse for yourself, James warned, his voice still calm. Judge Whitmore thrashed, her once dignified robe now crumpled against the floor. This is a mistake, she shrieked. I'll have your job for this. You hear me? I'll ruin you. James exhaled slowly. He'd heard those kinds of threats before, but Whitmore had no idea who she was dealing with. Within seconds, the bailiff stepped in, helping to restrain her. Whitmore continued to scream, kicking against the floor like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. The reporters sitting in the back of the courtroom had their phones out, capturing every moment. This was going to be all over the news within the hour. James stood up, straightening his uniform. His cover was officially blown, but he had gotten what he came for. As they lifted Judge Whitmore to her feet, she turned and glared at James with pure hatred. You think this is over? She seethed. James met her gaze. No, he said. It's just beginning. The judge was escorted out of the courtroom, her angry shouts echoing down the hallway. And just like that, the most feared woman in the courthouse had become a criminal herself. 3 days earlier, James sat in a dimly lit office in downtown Atlanta, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His supervisor, Special Agent Robert Miller, leaned against his desk, arms crossed. We've got a problem, Miller said, tossing a thick file onto the table. Judge Margaret Whitmore. James frowned, flipping open the file. He had heard the name before. She was notorious for her harsh sentencing, particularly toward Black and Latino defendants. There had been whispers for years about her bias, but no one had been able to prove anything. Until now. Miller nodded toward the folder. We've got evidence of corruption, bribes, tampering with jury selection, and something else. James glanced up. What? Miller's expression darkened. She's been caught using racial slurs. Not just in private, in open court. James exhaled through his nose. That's bad. It's more than bad, Miller said. It's criminal. But here's the issue. She's got connections. Powerful ones. If we go in with a traditional investigation, she'll have enough time to cover her tracks. James shut the file, already knowing where this was going. You need me undercover. Miller smirked. You read my mind. James leaned back in his chair, considering the situation. Undercover work wasn't new to him. He had taken down corrupt cops, dirty politicians, even human traffickers. But this was different. This was a sitting judge. One wrong move, and the entire case could fall apart. I'll do it, he said finally. Miller grinned. Knew you would. Now, standing in the middle of the courtroom with reporters snapping pictures, James felt the weight of the last 3 days settle on his shoulders. He had done what he came here to do, but something told him this wasn't over. Because people like Judge Whitmore didn't go down without a fight, and he had a feeling she wasn't going to make this easy. The courthouse was in chaos. Reporters swarmed the hallways, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions. Court officials whispered in hushed voices, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Judge Margaret Whitmore, one of the most feared and powerful figures in the justice system, had been dragged out of her own courtroom in handcuffs. James Carter walked past the commotion with a calm, measured pace. His job wasn't finished. He still had to process the arrest, ensure that all the evidence was secure, and prepare for what would undoubtedly be a high-profile trial. As he reached the elevator, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. James frowned. He hesitated for a second before answering. Carter, he said. A low, gravelly voice came through the receiver. You just made a big mistake. James's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A short chuckle. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you don't know who you're dealing with. The call ended. James stood still for a moment, the words lingering in his mind. He had dealt with threats before, plenty of them. But something about this one felt different. He slid his phone back into his pocket and stepped into the elevator. If Judge Whitmore had powerful friends, he had just made himself their #1 enemy. An hour later, James sat across from his supervisor, Agent Robert Miller, in a secure office at the FBI field office. The walls were lined with case files, crime scene photos, and maps pinned with locations marked in red ink. Miller leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. So, you're telling me you got a threat already? James nodded. Didn't recognize the voice. Could have been one of her people. Miller exhaled sharply. That woman's got more connections than a spider web. Judges, politicians, police captains. Hell, even a few business tycoons owe her favors. He tapped a folder on his desk. Taking her down was the easy part. Keeping her behind bars? That's the real challenge. James leaned forward, his expression serious. Then we need to move fast. Lock down the evidence. Make sure there's no way for her to walk. Miller nodded. Already in motion. But I'm worried about something else. James arched a brow. What? Miller folded his hands on the desk. You. James frowned. Me? Miller sighed. You just put yourself in the crosshairs of some very powerful people. You think Judge Whitmore is the only one who wanted you gone. You just humiliated her in front of the entire country. Someone out there is going to want payback. James crossed his arms. Let them try. Miller gave him a hard look. I mean it, Carter. You need to watch your back. James didn't respond. He had always known the risks. But he wasn't about to back down now. Meanwhile, inside a holding cell, Judge Whitmore sat on a cold metal bench, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was red with fury. She had spent decades commanding respect, controlling lives, bending the law to her will. And now, she was reduced to this. The steel door clanked open, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was tall, with slicked-back gray hair and a hard-set jaw. He sat down on the opposite bench and folded his hands. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. It's about time. The man didn't react. You embarrassed yourself today. Whitmore scowled. That boy set me up. The man gave her a cold look. He played his part well. You, on the other hand, lost control. Whitmore's fists clenched. Are you here to help me or insult me? The man sighed and leaned forward. We're handling it. But you need to stay quiet. Whitmore gritted her teeth. Do you have any idea what they're charging me with? If this goes to trial, I'm finished. The man tilted his head. Then we make sure it doesn't go to trial. Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. What are you saying? The man reached into his pocket, pulled out a small slip of paper, and slid it across the table. You still have friends in high places. Use them. Whitmore picked up the paper and read the name written on it. A slow, wicked smile spread across her lips. Consider it done. Later that night, James returned home to his small but comfortable apartment. He locked the door behind him and set his keys on the counter. His mind was still racing. The case wasn't over yet. Judge Whitmore was dangerous, but the people protecting her were even worse. He had just stepped into something bigger than he had expected. He poured himself a glass of water and took a slow sip. Then, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. James sighed and answered. What now? This time, there was no voice. Just silence. Then, the faint sound of breathing. James's jaw tightened. Whoever this is, you're wasting your time. Still, no response. Then, click. The call ended. James exhaled slowly, setting his phone down. Someone was watching him, and they wanted him to know it. James Carter didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkness of his apartment, his mind sharp, his muscles tense. Someone was watching him. Someone wanted him scared. But fear wasn't in his nature. By morning, he was already dressed and on his way back to the FBI field office. The city streets were buzzing with the usual Atlanta traffic, but James barely noticed. His thoughts were locked onto Judge Whitmore and the people pulling her strings. As he stepped into the office, Agent Robert Miller was already waiting for him, a grim look on his face. Come with me, Miller said without preamble. James followed him into a conference room where a flat-screen TV was mounted on the wall. Miller grabbed the remote and clicked a button. A video feed popped up. James' stomach tightened. It was security footage, taken from outside his apartment building. The timestamp read 3:42 a.m. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A black SUV was parked down the street, just outside the range of most security cameras. A figure in a dark hoodie stood near James's building, unmoving. Watching. Miller crossed his arms. We checked traffic cams. The SUV circled your block 6 times before finally stopping there. James exhaled through his nose. License plate. Miller shook his head. Fake. James clenched his jaw. They're getting bolder. They know who you are now, Miller said. And they're not happy. James took a step closer to the screen, watching the hooded figure. Something about the way they stood, calm, patient, made his skin crawl. They're waiting for something, James muttered. Miller nodded. Or someone. James turned away from the screen. He needed to move fast. Judge Whitmore was still behind bars, but it was only a matter of time before her people made their move. And when they did, he had to be ready. Meanwhile, inside the Fulton County Detention Center, Judge Margaret Whitmore sat in a small, dimly lit room, speaking in hushed tones into a prison phone. The guards couldn't hear her conversation. Her people had made sure of that. I want this handled, she hissed into the receiver. I don't care how. A voice on the other end of the line responded, calm and measured. He's not an easy target. Whitmore's nails dug into her palm. I don't care. Make him disappear. The voice hesitated. That'll cost extra. Whitmore's lips curled into a sneer. Do it. She slammed the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. James Carter had humiliated her. Now, she was going to return the favor. That afternoon, James decided to pay Judge Whitmore a visit. She had been transferred to a high-security holding facility while her charges were being processed, but James had enough clearance to see her. As he stepped into the holding area, a guard escorted him to a small interview room. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Judge Whitmore was led inside, her wrists shackled, her once imposing presence now reduced to a woman in an orange jumpsuit. Still, the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. Well, she drawled as she sat down across from him. The delivery boy returns. James didn't react. He simply leaned forward. You don't seem too worried, Judge. Whitmore smirked. Why should I be? You think putting me in here means you've won? James studied her carefully. She wasn't just arrogant. She was confident. Too confident for someone facing multiple felony charges. You're still making phone calls, James said. It wasn't a question. Whitmore smiled. You'd be amazed at how many people are willing to take my calls. James kept his expression neutral, but inside, his instincts screamed at him. She knew something, and whatever it wasn't good. Enjoy your time in here, Judge, he said as he stood. It won't be short. Whitmore chuckled softly. Oh, Agent Carter, she murmured. You really don't get it, do you? James frowned slightly. Whitmore leaned in. I don't stay in places like this. James stared at her, his pulse kicking up a notch. See you soon, she whispered. 2 hours later, the power went out at the detention center. A full-scale lockdown was triggered, alarms blaring through the facility. Guards scrambled to secure inmates, shouting orders over the noise. James was still inside the FBI field office when the news came in. Miller rushed into the room, his face pale. "She's gone." James stood up slowly. "What?" Miller swallowed hard. "Judge Whitmore. She's gone." James's blood ran cold. "How the hell did that happen?" Miller shook his head, still piecing it together, but someone hacked the security system. Cameras went dark. The backup generators failed. When the power came back, she was gone. James clenched his fists. He had just spoken to her. She knew this was going to happen. Whitmore was out. And now, she was coming for him. James Carter stood in the FBI field office, staring at Agent Miller, his mind racing. Judge Whitmore was gone. He had seen it in her eyes just hours ago. Her smug confidence, the way she whispered, "See you soon." She had known this was going to happen. And now she was back on the streets. James exhaled sharply, forcing his thoughts into order. "Tell me everything." Miller ran a hand through his graying hair. At exactly 6:17 p.m., the power cut out across the entire detention center. Backup generators were supposed to kick in within 10 seconds, but they never did. James' jaw clenched. They were sabotaged. Miller nodded grimly. "Looks that way." Security cameras shut down. Lockdown protocols failed. By the time power was restored, Whitmore's cell was empty. The guards we interviewed said they didn't see anything. She just vanished. James exhaled through his nose, his instincts sharpening. This wasn't a random breakout. Someone planned this. Miller sighed. "No doubt. And here's the kicker. We've got zero leads. No one saw who took her, and no vehicles were caught on surrounding traffic cams. Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing." James' stomach tightened. This wasn't just Whitmore's doing. Someone powerful was protecting her. Miller eyed him carefully. "You realize what this means, don't you?" James nodded. "She's coming after me." Miller gave a dry chuckle. "Yeah, and she won't be subtle about it." James didn't flinch. He had been targeted before, hunted by criminals far more dangerous than Whitmore. But there was something about this case that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just revenge. This was personal. Somewhere in Atlanta, Margaret Whitmore sat comfortably in the back seat of a black luxury SUV, sipping a glass of wine as the vehicle glided through the dimly lit streets. A man in a dark suit sat beside her, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He was one of the many people she had called in a favor from, a man who dealt with problems. She swirled her wine glass lazily. "How long until he's taken care of?" The man remained silent for a moment before answering. "A hit that high profile requires planning." Whitmore's lips curled into a sneer. "You've had 3 days to plan. I want him gone." The man glanced at her. "He's FBI. You kill an agent, and the entire government comes down on us." Whitmore's fingers tightened around her glass. "Then make it look like an accident." The man exhaled slowly. "We have eyes on him. We'll strike when the time is right." Whitmore leaned back, a slow smile creeping across her lips. Good. She had lost control for a moment in that courtroom. She had let her emotions get the best of her. But now, the tables were turning. James Carter had humiliated her. Now, she was going to erase him. James sat in his car in an underground parking garage, his mind running through every possibility. Whitmore's escape meant 2 things. 1, she had people willing to risk everything for her. 2, she wasn't going to disappear quietly. As he sat there, his phone vibrated. A text message popped up from an unknown number. James narrowed his eyes and opened it. "Enjoy your last days, Agent Carter." His pulse remained steady, but his fingers tightened around the phone. He had expected a move like this. He just didn't expect it to be this fast. A second message followed. "Look outside." James got twisted. He instinctively glanced up at his rearview mirror. Nothing. Slowly, he turned his head to the side window, scanning the dimly lit parking garage. Everything looked normal. Then, a shadow moved. James acted instantly. He reached under his seat, gripping the handle of his Glock 19. With a fluid motion, he unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out, gun at his side. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. "Show yourself," he said, his voice calm but firm. Silence. Then, a footstep. James turned sharply, raising his gun. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the concrete walls. A black SUV sat parked 2 rows away, engine idling softly. James took a slow step forward, his senses on high alert. Then the SUV's headlights flashed. Blinding white light. James shielded his eyes for a split second, just enough time for the SUV's tires to screech against the concrete. It was coming straight at him. James didn't hesitate. He moved, diving to the side. He rolled across the pavement just as the SUV barreled through the space where he had been standing. The force of its speed rattled the parked cars around them. James hit the ground, rolled onto one knee, and fired. Bang, bang, bang. The bullets struck the SUV's windshield, spiderwebbing the glass. But the vehicle didn't stop. Instead, it sped up. James had no time to think. He lunged behind a nearby pillar just as the SUV smashed into the row of parked cars behind him. The impact sent metal and glass flying. Alarms blared through the garage. For a second, everything was still. Then, the driver's side door swung open. James saw the silhouette of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie. James raised his gun. FBI, put your hands where I can see them. The man didn't hesitate. He ran. James bolted after him, his feet pounding against the concrete. The suspect sprinted toward the exit ramp, weaving between parked cars. James didn't lose focus. He was faster, stronger. The suspect reached the top of the ramp, then suddenly stopped. James skidded to a halt, gun raised. Then he saw why the man had stopped. Another black SUV was waiting at the top of the ramp. The passenger door flew open, and the suspect jumped inside. James fired off 2 more rounds, but the SUV peeled out of the garage at full speed, tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. James cursed under his breath. He quickly tapped his earpiece. "Carter to dispatch," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I need a vehicle pursuit alert. Black SUV, no plates. Just attempted a hit on a federal agent." A voice crackled in his ear. "Copy that, Agent Carter. Units are en route." James exhaled slowly, lowering his gun. This wasn't just a warning anymore. They had tried to kill him, and next time, they wouldn't miss. James Carter stood in the empty parking garage, the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline still thick in the air. The failed hit had only confirmed what he already knew. Judge Whitmore wasn't just running. She was fighting back, and she had powerful people backing her. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. James answered, his voice calm. "You're getting sloppy." A low chuckle came through the line. "And you're getting lucky." James recognized the voice this time. It belonged to a man named Victor Langston, a former intelligence officer who had gone rogue years ago. He was one of Whitmore's people, a hired gun who specialized in making problems disappear. James walked toward his car, his pace unhurried. "That wasn't luck, Victor. That was skill." Langston chuckled again. "Sure, but let's see how long that lasts. You just pissed off a lot of powerful people, Carter." James slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and put the call on speaker. "Yeah? And what happens next?" A short pause. "Then, we burn your world down." The line went dead. James stared at his phone for a moment before tossing it onto the passenger seat. He had heard threats like this before, but this time, it felt different. Whitmore wasn't just planning his death. She was planning to destroy him, and that meant he had to move first. Back at the FBI field office, James stormed into the main operations room, where Agent Miller was already waiting. Several agents sat at their desks, combing through security footage and phone records. Miller turned as James approached. "Let me guess. That wasn't just a random hit." James shook his head. "It was Victor Langston." Miller let out a low whistle. "That guy's a ghost. We've been trying to nail him for years." "Well, now he's working for Whitmore," James said. "And they're not just coming after me. They're going to hit everything." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Meaning?" James exhaled. "My family. My bank accounts. My reputation. They're going to tear apart every part of my life." Miller's face darkened. "Then we need to get ahead of them." James nodded. "I want every known associate of Whitmore on surveillance. I want financial records pulled. Phone taps. We need to know who is backing her and where she's getting her resources from." Miller waved over one of the tech agents. "You heard him. Get to work." The agent nodded and immediately began typing furiously on his keyboard. James turned back to Miller. "And I need to go off the grid." Miller raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" James nodded. "If they can't find me, they can't hit me." Miller considered this for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll put you under a secure alias. But you know as well as I do, that won't stop them. If Langston is involved, they'll find you." James smirked slightly. "Let them try. Somewhere in Atlanta." Victor Langston sat in a dimly lit room, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Across from him sat Margaret Whitmore, her nails tapping against the table impatiently. "You failed," she hissed. Langston exhaled smoke, completely unfazed. "Relax, Judge. We rattled him." Whitmore glared. "I don't want him rattled. I want him dead." Langston smirked. "And he will be. But first, we're going to make him suffer." Whitmore tilted her head slightly. "Go on." Langston leaned forward, placing a folder on the table. "Carter's clean. No dirt. No weaknesses." Whitmore's expression darkened. "Then why are we wasting time?" Langston smiled coldly. "Because his world isn't clean." He flipped open the folder, revealing pictures of James' younger sister, Camille Carter. She was a journalist, well respected in her field. She had no idea the kind of danger her brother was in. Whitmore's eyes gleamed. "Family." Langston nodded. "We go after her. We drag her name through the mud. And when Carter is too distracted trying to protect her." Whitmore finished his sentence, her smile widening. "We kill him." James pulled his car into a secluded lot behind an abandoned warehouse. He stepped out, scanning the area before making his way inside. A lone figure stood in the middle of the darkened space, arms crossed. She turned as he approached. Camille Carter. She was 5 years younger than James, but just as sharp, just as fearless. Her curly brown hair was pulled into a bun, and she wore a leather jacket over a simple blouse. She looked him up and down, her brown eyes filled with concern. "You dragged me out here in the middle of the night. What's going on?" James didn't waste time. "You're in danger." Camille frowned. "James, I'm a journalist. I'm always in danger." James shook his head. "This is different. Judge Whitmore is out, and she's coming after me. And that means you are a target now." Camille's face hardened. "Let me guess. They're going to try and ruin my career, discredit me, make me look like a fraud." James nodded. Camille scoffed. "Good luck with that. The truth is on my side." James sighed. "Camille, this isn't just about your reputation. These people kill for power." She crossed her arms. "And what's the plan then? Hide me away in some safe house." James exhaled. "No, we fight back." Camille raised an eyebrow. "You do realize I'm not an FBI agent, right?" James smirked. "No, but you are a journalist. And if there's one thing people like Whitmore hate, it's the truth." Camille's eyes lit up. "You want me to expose her?" James nodded. "We get ahead of her. We control the narrative. If we put everything out in the open before she can attack, we take away her power." Camille grinned. "Now that's something I can do." James placed a hand on her shoulder. "Be careful, Camille. She's dangerous." Camille smirked. "So am I." Across town, Judge Whitmore sat in a luxury hotel suite, sipping champagne. A television screen in front of her played the news. The anchors were still discussing her shocking escape, speculating on her whereabouts. Then, suddenly, a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. Exclusive report. FBI uncovers Judge Whitmore's secret corruption scandal. Whitmore's smile faded. She sat up straighter as a familiar face appeared on the screen, Camille Carter. The young journalist stared directly into the camera. For years, Judge Margaret Whitmore has used her position to manipulate the justice system. But today, we expose the truth. Federal investigators have uncovered evidence linking Whitmore to illegal bribery, jury tampering, and organized crime. Whitmore's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. Camille continued. "The FBI has provided us with documents proving Whitmore's involvement in rigging cases and silencing witnesses. But most importantly, her recent escape from prison was no accident. It was orchestrated by a powerful network that does not want justice to be served." Whitmore shook with rage. Langston stood in the corner, arms crossed. "Looks like they got ahead of us." Whitmore's eyes burned with fury. "Then we burn them to the ground." Judge Margaret Whitmore stood in front of the shattered champagne glass, her hands balled into fists. Her face twisted in rage as she watched Camille Carter on the television screen, exposing every dirty secret she had spent years keeping hidden. This was supposed to be her moment of victory. She was supposed to be the one pulling the strings, controlling the narrative. Instead, the Carter siblings had flipped the game on her. Langston, standing coolly in the corner of the luxury suite, let out a low whistle. "That's gonna sting." Whitmore spun on him, her eyes burning. "I want her gone." Langston smirked. "Yeah, I figured." Whitmore stepped closer, her voice a sharp hiss. "You don't figure, Langston. You do." Langston exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. You sure you want to go that far? Killing a journalist is messy, brings a lot of heat. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Do I look like I care? Langston studied her for a moment before nodding. All right, we'll make it happen. Whitmore straightened her posture. And make sure it's not sloppy. I don't want it looking like a hit. Langston grinned. Relax, Judge. Accidents happen all the time. Whitmore turned back toward the TV, where Camille's face still filled the screen. She was smiling. Enjoy it while you can, Whitmore thought darkly. It won't last. Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, James Carter was already preparing for the next attack. He knew Whitmore wouldn't take this lightly. Miller stood beside him, arms crossed as they both watched Camille's live broadcast on a large screen. She really went all in, Miller said, shaking his head. James smirked. That's Camille for you. Miller exhaled. You realize Whitmore is going to come for her now, right? James nodded. That's why I need extra protection on her. She's not just my sister. She's our best weapon against Whitmore. Miller rubbed his temple. We've already got agents watching her place, but if Langston's involved, that might not be enough. James considered this for a moment before making a decision. I'm taking her somewhere safe, he said. Somewhere Whitmore can't reach her. Miller raised an eyebrow. You have a place in mind? James nodded. Yeah, but I'm going to need some backup. Miller smirked. When do I ever say no to that? 2 hours later, James pulled up outside Camille's apartment in a black SUV with tinted windows. His pulse remained steady, but he wasn't taking any chances. He stepped out of the car, scanning the area. Everything looked normal, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He moved quickly to Camille's door and knocked twice. Seconds later, she opened it. James, she greeted, arms crossed. Let me guess. You're here to kidnap me. James smirked. More like relocate you. Camille sighed. You know, I thought exposing Whitmore would put pressure on her, not put a target on my back. James tilted his head. You knew the risks. Camille rolled her eyes. Yeah, fine. Where are we going? James glanced over his shoulder. Someplace safe. Pack a bag. Camille gave him a long look before disappearing inside. A few minutes later, she re-emerged with a small duffel bag. As she stepped into the hallway, James' gut suddenly twisted. Something was wrong. The air felt too still. The silence was too deep. Then, a shadow moved in the stairwell. James reacted instantly. Down, he shouted, grabbing Camille and pulling her to the ground just as bang, bang, bang. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the walls, shattering glass, sending drywall dust into the air. James rolled, shielding Camille as the shots kept coming. Then, silence. James lifted his head just in time to see two masked men sprinting down the stairwell. His instincts screamed. He yanked his gun from its holster and chased. The gunmen bolted for the exit, their footsteps pounding against the tile floor. James moved fast, dodging debris, his heartbeat steady. As he reached the building's back door, he caught a glimpse of the getaway vehicle, a black sedan with tinted windows. The gunman leaped inside. James fired. Bang, bang. His bullets slammed into the rear window, shattering it. But it was too late. The car sped off, tires screeching against the pavement. James cursed under his breath and lowered his weapon. This wasn't just a warning. This was an execution attempt. And they had almost succeeded. Back in Camille's apartment, James helped her to her feet. She was shaken but unharmed. You okay? He asked, scanning her for injuries. Camille let out a shaky breath. Yeah, I'm good. James placed a hand on her shoulder. We need to go? Now. Camille nodded, grabbing her bag. Let's move. James led her outside to the SUV, scanning the streets for any signs of a second attack. They got in, and James sped off, heading straight for their safe house. Whitmore had crossed the line. This wasn't just about silencing them anymore. She wanted them dead. And James was about to make sure that didn't happen. Across town, in the dimly lit hotel suite, Langston placed his phone on the table and exhaled. Whitmore stood nearby, her arms crossed. Well? She asked impatiently. Langston shook his head. Carter's still alive. Whitmore's jaw tightened. And the sister? Langston exhaled. She's fine. Carter got her out. Whitmore was silent for a long moment. Then, in a cold, quiet voice, she said, I want them dead, Victor. Langston gave her a sideways glance. You want something done right, you do it yourself. Whitmore smirked. Then maybe it's time I got my hands dirty. Langston chuckled. That's what I like to hear. Whitmore picked up her glass of wine, and took a slow sip. Carter thought he had won. He thought he was safe, but he had no idea what was coming next. And by the time he did, it would be too late. James Carter didn't let up on the gas until they were deep in the Georgia countryside. The safe house was miles away from the city, hidden behind thick trees and an unmarked dirt road. It was a secure, government-owned property that had been used in past undercover operations. Off the grid, no electronic records, no way to track them here. As the SUV came to a stop, Camille let out a breath. I hope you've got food in there. I didn't exactly have time to pack snacks while dodging bullets. James smirked slightly, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the area. There's supplies inside, but we won't be here long. Camille frowned as she stepped out of the car. And where exactly are we going after this? James shut the door and locked the vehicle. Wherever I need to go to end this. Camille crossed her arms. You mean alone, don't you? James didn't answer, but his silence spoke for him. Camille sighed. You always do this. You shut people out when things get dangerous. Newsflash, big brother, I just had my apartment shot up. I'm already in this. James turned to face her. That's exactly why I need you somewhere safe. Camille's expression hardened. No, you need me fighting. James exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wanted to argue, but the truth was, she wasn't wrong. Camille had already proven she was a force to be reckoned with. And right now, they needed every advantage they could get. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you follow my lead. Camille smirked. I always follow your lead. I just do it louder. James shook his head with a small chuckle, then gestured for her to follow him inside. As they stepped into the cabin, James immediately checked the security setup, motion detectors, reinforced locks, satellite phone. Everything was still in place. Camille dropped her bag onto a nearby chair. So, what's the plan? James sat down at the wooden table, pulling out his phone. We need to flip the game on Whitmore again. The last move hurt her, but not enough. She's desperate now, which means she'll start making mistakes. Camille leaned against the counter. And how do we make her mess up? James's eyes darkened. We set a trap. Meanwhile, in downtown Atlanta, Judge Margaret Whitmore sat in a sleek black sedan parked near the city courthouse. She had ditched the luxury hotels, too easy to track. Instead, she was using a network of safe houses provided by her remaining allies. But even those were disappearing fast. Her face was tight with frustration as she scrolled through the latest news reports. Camille Carter's exposé had sent shockwaves through the media. Prosecutors were now looking into all of her past cases. Everything was falling apart. Langston sat in the driver's seat, his arms resting lazily on the steering wheel. Bad news? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Whitmore gritted her teeth. They're picking apart my legacy piece by piece. Langston chuckled. Well, yeah, that's what happens when you get caught. Whitmore turned to glare at him. I didn't get caught, she snapped. I was set up. Langston smirked. Yeah. Doesn't change the fact that Carter just turned you into public enemy number one. Whitmore's nails dug into her palm. Then it's time to remind Carter who he's dealing with. Langston raised an eyebrow. I assume you have a plan? Whitmore's lips curled into a slow smile. I know exactly where to hit him. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. A few moments later, a voice answered. It's done. Whitmore's smile widened. Perfect. Langston gave her a curious look. What did you just do? Whitmore leaned back, her expression smug. I made sure Carter loses everything. Back at the safe house, James was reviewing the latest intel when his phone vibrated with an urgent notification. He frowned as he checked the screen. Bank account alert. All funds frozen. His stomach dropped. Then another message popped up. FBI internal memo. Agent James Carter under investigation. James' pulse pounded. Camille, seeing the sudden shift in his expression, stepped closer. What is it? James exhaled, his jaw tightening. Whitmore just made her move. Camille read the messages over his shoulder. Her eyes widened. Wait, you're under investigation? For what? James clenched his fists. It doesn't matter. This is her play. She's using her connections to frame me. Camille's face paled. James, if the FBI turns against you. James took a slow breath. Then I'm on my own. Camille shook her head. No, you've got me. James met her gaze, grateful but still tense. If Whitmore was pulling these kinds of strings, things were about to get much worse. Then, a knock at the door. James and Camille both went dead still. The safe house was off the grid. No one was supposed to know they were here. James silently reached for his gun, motioning for Camille to stay back. Another knock. Then a voice. Agent Carter. Open up. James frowned. He knew that voice. He moved cautiously to the door and peeked through the peephole. His stomach twisted. Standing outside were 3 FBI agents. And at the front of them, Agent Robert Miller. James unlocked the door, but kept his grip tight on his weapon as he opened it slightly. Miller. Miller's face was unreadable. We need to talk. James eyed the other agents behind him. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Camille stepped forward cautiously. What's going on? Miller exhaled, his jaw tight. James, I need you to come with us. James' instincts screamed at him. Why? Miller's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, in a low voice, he said, There's a warrant out for your arrest. Silence. Camille's breath hitched. What? James' mind raced. On what charges? Miller's expression darkened. Espionage. Treason. James froze. This was bad. Camille looked between them, shock written across her face. That's insane. You know he didn't do anything. Miller's voice was quiet but firm. I know, but this order comes from way above my pay grade. James clenched his jaw. Whitmore had won this round. She had turned his own agency against him. Miller took a slow breath. James, you need to run. James blinked. What? Miller's voice dropped to a whisper. They're not bringing you in for questioning. They're bringing you in to disappear. James' blood ran cold. Then, one of the agents behind Miller reached for his gun. James didn't hesitate. He slammed the door shut, locking it as Camille gasped. James, what do we do? She asked, her voice shaking. James turned to her, his mind already racing through 1,000 possibilities. We get out of here, he said, because now, the entire FBI was hunting him, and Whitmore had just made him America's most wanted. James Carter barely had time to think. On the other side of the door, the FBI agents were already moving. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden porch. One of them shouted an order. James Carter, open this door now. James grabbed Camille's wrist. We need to move, now. Camille's breath was shaky, but she nodded. Where? James' mind raced. The front door was no longer an option, and the safe house was too small for many escape routes. But he had planned for contingencies. The basement, he said, already pulling her toward the back of the cabin. They sprinted down the hall, the echoes of movement behind them growing louder. Then, crash. The front door exploded inward. Camille let out a startled gasp as the agents stormed inside. James shoved open the basement door and pulled her through, slamming it shut behind them. He flicked the lock, just as he heard footsteps pounding toward the hallway. They didn't have much time. The basement was dark, lit only by a small emergency light in the corner. The space smelled of damp wood and dust, but James wasn't focused on that. He rushed to the farthest wall and yanked aside an old shelving unit. Behind it, a hidden escape hatch. Camille's eyes widened. You built a tunnel? James didn't answer. He simply unlatched the panel and pushed it open, revealing a narrow underground passage. Then, bang. The basement door shook violently as the agents above tried to break through. James turned to Camille. Go. Now. Camille didn't argue. She crawled into the tunnel, her body disappearing into the darkness. James followed right behind her, pulling the panel closed behind them just as, boom, the basement door burst open. Dust filled the air. Heavy boots stormed into the basement. But James and Camille were already gone. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for them to crawl through. Dirt crumbled beneath their hands as they moved. Camille panted. Where does this lead? James' voice was low. About a quarter mile from here. Near the creek. She swallowed hard. You really thought of everything, huh? James didn't answer. He was too focused on what came next. Because if the FBI had turned against him, there was only one possible explanation. Judge Whitmore had someone high up pulling the strings. And whoever that was, they wanted him gone. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Agent Robert Miller stood in the wreckage of the basement, staring at the empty room. One of the other agents, Agent Donahue, stepped forward, scanning the space with his flashlight. They're not here, Donahue muttered. Miller exhaled slowly. No, but Carter won't stay off the grid for long. He's too good. Donahue turned to him. Are we really going through with this? Miller didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he knew James Carter was innocent. But orders were orders. And the people giving them? They weren't the kind of people you said no to. Miller clenched his jaw. Find him, he said coldly. And if he resists? Donahue raised an eyebrow. We take him out. Miller looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yeah. The tunnel opened into a dense patch of woods near a fast-moving creek. James and Camille emerged, breathing heavily, their clothes covered in dirt. Camille wiped sweat from her brow. Okay, what now? James scanned the dark forest around them. We keep moving. Camille hesitated. Where? James exhaled. I need to find out who inside the FBI is helping Whitmore. Camille frowned. And how do we do that when you're literally America's most wanted? James clenched his jaw. By going after the one person Whitmore is still protecting. Camille's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. You're talking about Victor Langston. James nodded. He's been her right-hand man since this started. If we take him down, we can break her entire network. Camille shook her head. James, Langston is a ghost. No paper trails, no digital footprint. How do we even find him? James gave her a small, dangerous smirk. He'll come to us. Camille blinked. What? James pulled a burner phone from his pocket and started typing a message. Camille leaned in. Who are you texting? James' eyes darkened. Langston. Camille stared. How the hell do you have his number? James didn't answer. He just hit send. The message was short. Let's talk. Face to face. No games. I know what you're hiding. Camille's eyes widened. Are you crazy? He'll just send more assassins after us. James smirked. No, he won't. Camille gave him a look. And why not? James slid the burner phone back into his pocket. Because he's too paranoid for that. He won't trust anyone but himself to handle me. Camille exhaled sharply. And what if this is a trap? James' smirk faded. It's definitely a trap. Somewhere in Atlanta. Victor Langston sat in a dimly lit bar, sipping a whiskey when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and checked the message. James Carter. Langston's lips curled into a slow, amused grin. Well, he muttered. He finally grew some balls. A man sitting across from him raised an eyebrow. Who is it? Langston swirled his drink. Someone who doesn't know when to quit. The man leaned forward. What's the play? Langston's grin widened. We give him what he wants, he said. A meeting. He downed the rest of his drink. And then, Langston chuckled. And then we bury him. James Carter sat in the dim glow of a roadside diner, the scent of stale coffee and fried food lingering in the air. He stirred a steaming cup in front of him, but his mind was far from the drink. Across from him, Camille sat with her arms crossed, her expression tense. You realize this is insane, right? She muttered. James didn't look up. I know. You're walking into a trap. I know. Camille exhaled sharply. Then why are we doing this? James finally met her gaze. Because if I don't, Whitmore wins. Camille shook her head. You think Langston's just going to show up and talk? He's not some corrupt politician. He's a killer. James leaned back, his expression unreadable. Which is exactly why I need to be the one to face him. Camille frowned. And what's stopping him from putting a bullet in you the second he sees you? James smirked slightly. Because I know something he doesn't. Camille narrowed her eyes. What? James pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Camille's breath caught. What is that? James' smirk deepened. Insurance. Camille leaned closer. Where the hell did you get that? James exhaled. Let's just say Whitmore isn't the only one with friends in high places. This drive contains everything. Langston's past crimes, offshore accounts, every dirty deal he's ever been involved in. Camille blinked. And you didn't think to tell me you had this? James shrugged. It wasn't time yet. Camille stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. So what's the plan? You wave this in his face and hope he backs down. James smirked. Not exactly. Before Camille could press further, the diner's door creaked open. A wave of silence passed over the room as a man stepped inside. Victor Langston. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek black suit. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto James the moment he spotted him. Camille tensed. Here we go. James remained still as Langston strolled toward their booth, a slow, amused grin spreading across his face. Didn't think you had it in you, Carter, Langston said as he slid into the seat across from him. James didn't blink. You're getting sloppy, Langston. Langston chuckled. Am I? He leaned back, smirking. Seems to me you're the one with a bounty on your head. James ignored the jab. Let's cut the crap. You and I both know how this ends. Langston tilted his head. Oh, enlighten me. James placed the flash drive between them. Langston's smirk faltered. What's this? James folded his hands. Your entire life, Langston. Every job, every deal, every murder for hire you've done for Whitmore and her people. Langston's jaw tightened slightly, but he masked it well. And James leaned forward. And it's already uploaded to multiple cloud servers. You kill me? It goes public. Langston exhaled through his nose. Clever. James smirked. I thought so. Langston stared at him for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the table. Then, to James' surprise, he let out a small chuckle. You know, Langston mused, I almost respect you. James raised an eyebrow. Almost. Langston grinned. Almost. He leaned in slightly. But here's the thing, Carter. You might have me cornered, but Whitmore? She doesn't go down that easy. James narrowed his eyes. She's already falling apart. It's over. Langston's grin widened. You really think so? James hesitated. Langston's smirk deepened. You think she didn't have a backup plan? James' pulse quickened. What are you talking about? Langston exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. You should have stayed hidden, Carter. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and slid it across the table. James hesitated before looking at the screen. His breath stilled. Displayed on the phone was a live security feed from inside the FBI field office. James' eyes widened as he saw Agent Robert Miller being dragged out in handcuffs by federal officers. Camille gasped. Miller. Langston leaned back. Whitmore knew she couldn't take you out first, so she went after the next best thing. James clenched his fists. What are the charges? Langston shrugged. Espionage. Treason. Same thing they tried to pin on you. He smirked. And here's the best part. Every agent who might have been on your side, they're either being arrested or transferred. By tomorrow, the entire system will be hers. James' mind raced. If Whitmore had that much influence left, they were running out of time. Langston picked up his phone, smirking. So, tell me, Carter, what's your next move? James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He needed to act fast. Because if Whitmore took control of the FBI, there'd be nowhere left to run. Meanwhile, in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline, Margaret Whitmore swirled a glass of wine in her hand, a satisfied smirk on her lips. The news played on the massive TV screen across the room. Breaking. FBI agent Robert Miller arrested on espionage charges. Whitmore took a slow sip, savoring the moment. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, Carter would have nowhere left to hide. And when that moment came, she would end him. For good. James Carter clenched his fists under the diner table, his mind racing as he stared at the live feed on Langston's phone. Robert Miller, his only real ally left in the FBI, was being dragged out of headquarters in handcuffs. Whitmore had made her move. She had control now. Camille swallowed hard. James, if she's taking over the FBI, we're out of time. Langston smirked. She owns the game now, Carter. Face it, you're done. James slowly exhaled, keeping his expression unreadable. His mind worked furiously, analyzing every option. He had to be careful. One wrong move, and Langston would turn this meeting into an execution. Then, James did something that surprised both Camille and Langston. He smiled. Langston raised an eyebrow. Something funny? James leaned back, folding his arms. Yeah, you. Langston's smirk faltered slightly. How's that? James chuckled. You actually think Whitmore is going to let you walk away from this? Langston's expression flickered. What are you talking about? James tilted his head. You really think you're safe? That once she's finished with me, she's not coming for you next? Langston narrowed his eyes, but James could see the doubt creeping in. James leaned forward. She's already cleaning house. Miller's gone. The agents who could have helped me? Gone. And once she's done using you, he smirked, she's going to make you disappear next. Langston's jaw clenched. James could tell he had hit a nerve. You know I'm right. James pressed. You've been in this game long enough to see it. The moment you're no longer useful, Whitmore will throw you under the bus, just like she did with Miller. Langston didn't say anything. Camille leaned in. You want to end up just another loose end? Or do you want to flip the board? Langston's fingers tapped against the table, his expression unreadable. James stayed silent, watching him carefully. Finally, Langston exhaled and looked at James. If I do this, I want full immunity. James smirked. Help me take Whitmore down. I'll make sure you walk away. Langston studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. James exhaled. All right, then let's finish this. Meanwhile, inside an FBI black site, Robert Miller sat in a cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. His face was bruised, evidence of a rough arrest. The door creaked open. A pair of polished heels clicked against the floor. Judge Margaret Whitmore stepped inside, her expression smug. Miller exhaled, shaking his head. You really think this is going to stick? Whitmore smirked, circling the table. Oh, I don't think, Agent Miller. I know. Miller glared at her. You overplayed your hand, Whitmore. You should have just disappeared. Whitmore chuckled. And let Carter win? No, I don't run. I erase my problems. She leaned in slightly, her voice turning cold. And you, Miller? You were never a problem. Just collateral damage. Miller exhaled. You're making a mistake. Whitmore smirked. No, Miller. Carter made a mistake. She straightened up, adjusting her expensive blazer. And I'm about to correct it. She turned to leave. But Miller's next words froze her in place. Carter's coming for you. Whitmore stopped in the doorway. Slowly, she turned back, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Miller smirked despite his injuries. You think this is over? You think you've won? Whitmore clenched her jaw. Miller chuckled. Oh, you really don't know Carter, do you? Whitmore exhaled through her nose. Carter is done. He's a fugitive. He has no power, no resources. Miller smiled. That's what you think. Whitmore studied him for a moment. Then, with a scoff, she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Miller exhaled, his smirk fading. James, you better have a plan. Back at Langston's safe house, James studied the blueprints of the FBI headquarters. Camille peered over his shoulder. You cannot be serious. James didn't look up. Completely serious. You want to break into the FBI? James nodded. Langston leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Ballsy. Stupid, but ballsy. James tapped a section of the blueprint. Whitmore is keeping Miller in the black site below the headquarters. That's where we hit. Camille exhaled sharply. You're insane. James smirked. I prefer determined. Langston rubbed his jaw. And how do we get in? The place is locked down tighter than a military base. James pointed at a side entrance. Through here. Security shift change happens at 11:47 p.m. That gives us a 7-minute window to slip inside before the next guard rotation. Camille shook her head. This is suicide. James met her gaze. It's our only shot. Langston exhaled. Fine. But once we're in, how do we find Miller? James pulled out a security pass from his pocket. Langston raised an eyebrow. How the hell did you get that? James smirked. Let's just say an old friend owed me a favor. Langston chuckled. All right, Carter. You got balls, I'll give you that. Camille sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. We're actually doing this, aren't we? James nodded. Yeah, we are. He looked at Langston. Get your gear. We move in 1 hour. Meanwhile, in Whitmore's penthouse, a phone buzzed. Whitmore picked it up, her eyes narrowing. A voice on the other end spoke quickly. Whitmore's expression darkened. What? She hissed. She listened for a few more moments, then hung up, her pulse pounding. Carter was coming, and if she didn't stop him now, he would end her. She turned to one of her guards. Mobilize everyone. I want Carter dead by sunrise. James strapped a silencer onto his weapon, checked his ammo, glanced at Camille and Langston. You both ready? Langston smirked. Always. Camille exhaled. Let's get this over with. James nodded. All right, let's go, because this was it. The final move. And only one side was walking away from this. James Carter adjusted the earpiece in his ear as he crouched behind a concrete barrier outside the FBI headquarters. The city streets were quiet at this hour, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of passing traffic. Beside him, Camille Carter checked her tablet, tracking security camera feeds Langston had hacked into. Langston, kneeling a few feet away, finished loading his weapon. We get one shot at this, he muttered. James nodded. Then let's make it count. Their mission was clear. Break into the FBI's black site, extract Robert Miller, and expose Judge Whitmore's entire operation before she tightened her grip on the bureau. And time was running out. James glanced at Camille. Security shift change in 3-2. She held up a hand. Now. James, Langston, and Camille moved fast. They slipped through the side entrance, bypassing the security checkpoint just before the new shift arrived. Inside, the sterile hallways were dimly lit, filled with the quiet hum of surveillance cameras and monitors. Langston tapped his earpiece. Basement level. 2 floors down. That's where they're holding Miller. James nodded. Let's go. They weaved through the corridors, sticking to the shadows. Langston used an electronic keycard to override door locks. Camille kept an eye on security feeds, and James led the way, his weapon steady in his grip. Then, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Attention all units. James Carter is in the building. Dead or alive, bring him in." Camille's eyes widened. "They know we're here." Langston cursed under his breath. "So much for stealth." James exhaled sharply. "Change of plan. We fight our way through." The alarm blared. Footsteps thundered down the hall. And then, bang, bang, bang. Bullets ripped through the air as armed FBI operatives stormed toward them. James fired back, ducking behind a row of filing cabinets. Camille pulled her own gun, taking careful shots. Langston threw a flashbang grenade. The explosion of light and sound stunned the agents, giving James the opening he needed. "Geo," he barked. They rushed forward, taking down the last 2 guards before reaching the stairwell. James kicked the door open. "Move." They raced down to the basement level, where the black site's high-security cells were located. Langston pulled up his hacked access codes. Miller's in cell 9. James and Camille covered the hallway as Langston worked the panel. Beep, beep, click. The cell unlocked. Inside, Miller sat against the cold wall, his face bruised but determined. His eyes widened when he saw James. "Took you long enough." James smirked. "You ready to go?" Miller cracked his knuckles. "Let's get the hell out of here." They turned to leave and walked straight into a firing squad. Guns raised, lasers trained on their chests, and standing at the front, Judge Margaret Whitmore. She smirked, arms crossed. Well, well, well." James tightened his grip on his weapon. Whitmore chuckled. "This is where it ends, Carter." James smirked. "For you?" "Yeah." Whitmore's eyes flashed with rage. "Drop your guns. Now." Camille swallowed hard. James didn't move. Neither did Langston. Then, James grinned. Whitmore frowned. "What?" Then she heard it. The sound of dozens of boots storming into the room. James hadn't come alone. A full team of FBI agents loyal to Miller burst into the basement, weapons raised. Whitmore froze. Miller smirked. "I made a few calls before I got locked up." Whitmore's face twisted in rage. No, this is my bureau." James stepped closer. "Not anymore." Click. The sound of handcuffs locking around her wrists. One of the agents grabbed her roughly. "Margaret Whitmore, you are under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder of a federal agent." Whitmore screamed. "You can't do this. I own this system." James leaned in. "Not anymore, you don't." Whitmore thrashed, her power gone. And for the first time in her life, she was powerless. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was packed. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Margaret Whitmore sat in shackles, her once flawless image shattered. James and Camille stood at the back of the courtroom as the judge delivered the final verdict. Guilty on all charges. Whitmore's face fell. She had lost. For good. Camille exhaled, turning to James. "We did it." James nodded. "Yeah, we did." Langston, sitting beside them, smirked. "Guess I picked the right side after all." Miller, standing on James' other side, patted him on the shoulder. "Hell of a job, Carter." James exhaled, the weight finally lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, justice had won. That evening, James and Camille sat on a rooftop overlooking the city, the cool breeze passing over them. Camille sipped a beer. "So what now?" James smirked. "You tell me." She chuckled. "I might write a book about this." James raised an eyebrow. "A book?" Camille grinned. "Why not? How my brother took down a corrupt FBI judge. Bestseller material." James laughed. "You're ridiculous." She nudged him. "And you wouldn't have it any other way." James exhaled, watching the city lights twinkle below. He had been hunted, framed, targeted by one of the most powerful people in the country. And he had won. Justice had been served. And finally, he was free.